Welcome to another edition of Fight for Justice. I'm Arthur Fite of the Fite Law Firm here in the Anderson-Calhoun County area. Tonight, I think we're going to have a very interesting show for you. How many of you have ever been on a highway and you felt threatened or endangered by an 18-wheeler? Well, tonight we're going to talk about those kinds of things with somebody who is in the safety consulting business. Whitney Morgan of Birmingham, Alabama owns Motor Carrier Safety Consultants in Birmingham. He investigates truck accidents. He gives deposition testimony in cases involving truck accidents. He explains what went wrong that causes accidents to occur. And I think you're going to find some of the things he's got to tell you tonight very interesting. Whitney, it's welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good to be here.
First of all, if you would tell our audience a little bit about your background in the truck safety industry.
Certainly. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration with a major in transportation. I went to work as a special agent or highway safety management specialist for the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration. At that time, it was the Bureau of Motor Carrier Safety. It's now the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And as part of that job, I investigated and reconstructed commercial motor vehicle accidents, primarily those of a catastrophic type nature or high dollar damage, multiple fatality type accident. Did multiple audits and compliance reviews of all different types and sizes of motor carriers and shippers of hazardous materials, performed roadside inspections of drivers and commercial motor vehicles, and worked very closely with various state, local, and city law enforcement agencies pertaining to commercial motor vehicle compliance, enforcement, and safety.
And I noticed you brought with you the Federal Motor Safety Carrier regulations. I'm just going to hold this up. It's almost like the tax code, but this is the regulations for trucking industry. And Whitney is, if I don't mind saying this, an expert on these regulations. He can tell you where a footnote is. It may help you in your case. He's done that for me. He told me about a footnote, and I found it, and sure enough, I've used it in a case in discovery that helped pin down a trucking company. So this is what you go by. Now, how long have you had your own company?
I started my company in March of 1983, so over 30 years now.
Would you say how many motor vehicle safety or accidents have you investigated involving big trucks?
Oh gosh, it's been hundreds. I still work quite a bit with motor carriers and do driver training, and I train carriers with regard to compliance with the regs, safety of operation, supervisor and management training. But I also do quite a bit of expert work, litigation consulting in truck-related accidents.
Now, people in our audience may be familiar that Alabama has what's called rules of the road that apply to vehicles. And you and I are both familiar with those rules. They talk about speeding, and just because you have a speed limit doesn't mean you should go that speed. You ought to go as safely as the conditions permit. But in the trucking industry, how would you compare the rules of the road that Alabama has with the number of regulations involving safety trucking?
Well, because there are specific regulations that are peculiar strictly to trucking companies and truck drivers, and because you consider the overdimensional aspect of a truck, the oversize, the overweight, the overlength, that really magnifies those issues when it comes to safety of operation, when it comes to speed safe for the prevailing conditions, whether it be rain or snow or ice, any low traction situation. It really dramatically affects the commercial vehicles, the big trucks, more so than it does cars, but certainly affects both of those.
Now, in order for a big trucking company to be authorized to operate on the roads, what do they have to do?
Well, they have to register with the Department of Transportation. In this case, it's the Surface Transportation Board and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And they have to Basically, when they get their USDOT numbers and their operating authorities, they have to fill out an application. And as part of that application process, they actually have to certify that they will have someone responsible for safety and compliance and knowledge of the applicable safety regulations, that they will have program for things such as alcohol and drug testing, qualifications of drivers, safe driving of commercial motor vehicles, hours of service of commercial motor vehicles, and inspection, repair, and maintenance of those commercial motor vehicles. So they basically have to certify that they have all the necessary safety management controls in place and functioning to meet the safety fitness standards and to comply with all the applicable safety regulations.
That is the trucking company side of it. What about the driver side? What do they have to do?
Well, the drivers, in order to drive a commercial motor vehicle, they have to, and there's two definitions of commercial motor vehicle. There's the definition of a vehicle that is in excess of 10,001 gross vehicle weight rated pounds, but less than 26,001. For those type of vehicles, and generally those vehicles are what we call straight trucks, the non-articulated, not a tractor and trailer, but just a regular box truck or box van, something like that. Those drivers have to do everything regarding the regs other than the alcohol and drug testing, or have what's called a commercial driver's license. If you drive a vehicle that's in excess of 26,000 gross vehicle weight rated pounds, which is the weight of the truck plus the weight of the cargo, then those individuals have to have what's called the commercial driver's license, or CDL. And in order to do that, they have to be knowledgeable of all of the things that are in this manual, which is this is a model manual that was developed and that all the states have adopted for the commercial driver's license.
Well, let me ask you this. What is the heaviest? Now, I've got an RV. It weighs 26,000 pounds.
Sure.
I don't have to have a CDL. Well, what's generally the highest, heaviest weighted truck on the highways?
Well, you can actually get, for some of the multi-axle trucks that are the specialized carriers, they can be well over 100,000 pounds. Generally, you're looking at a maximum weight of about 80,000 pounds with a 10% overage to about 88,000 pounds.
Now, we're going to, at the end of this segment in a second, but let's compare the weight of an average vehicle, which may be 5,000 or 6,000 pounds on the high end.
Well, you're talking about for an SUV, but
Yeah.
for a car, you may be 3,500,
3,000.
4,000.
What, just theoretically, or maybe in reality, what is the difference in the stopping distance of a car versus an 80,000 pound weighted truck?
Well, it's really a tremendous difference. Those vehicles, because of their overall size, their weight, their length, the types of tires and brakes that are on those vehicles, and you've got too what's called, what we talk about with air brakes is brake lag, and that's the time from when the driver applies the brake to when it actually has brakes. So the stopping distances are exponentially longer for those types of vehicles.
All right, we're at the end of our first segment here. In the second and third, we're going into more detail about this. We're going to try to give you some information that I think you'll find interesting. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to the second segment of tonight's show, and what we have as our guest Whitney Morgan of Motor Vehicle Consultants in Birmingham. He has been in this business for 30 years. He investigates trucking accidents to determine cause, what went wrong and why it went wrong, and usually that either ends up in court testimony or depositions prior to trial. We were talking about the regulatory environment of trucking and how much greater it is than automobiles. Now I would like to turn to the subject of what causes most commonly truck accidents, Whitney. What would you say was the number one cause of trucking accidents?
Well, I would have to say for both automobiles and trucks, it's driver error typically.
And what is the most common driver error committed by truck drivers?
Well, it's too fast for conditions is one of the primary factors. Following distances is also a primary factor. And things like driver fatigue and inattention also are factors.
You brought up following too closely. I don't think there's anybody out there who hasn't been followed by a big truck and they feel like they're right on your bumper. Why do they do that?
Well, a lot of it is they're trying to save time, but they're really not doing that. And when we train truck drivers in this environment for these vehicles, we try to get the drivers to understand the various components that are involved in stopping distances. And those are the actual perception time and distance, the reaction time and distance, and those are times and distances where there is not any braking at all. And at highway speeds, that can involve a couple hundred feet or more before the vehicle's brakes are even activated. And then with trucks, because of the air brakes, you have what we call brake lag, which really involves about a half a second. So we typically talk about 3/4 of a second for perception time, 3/4 of a second for reaction time, half a second roughly for brake lag time. So there's roughly 2 full seconds before there's even brakes activated.
And at 60 miles an hour, how many feet do you travel in 2 seconds?
Well, you're looking at roughly 88 feet per second, and because of that, they can travel quite a distance. And when we talk about truck drivers, and we talk about really any individual operating a vehicle of any kind, because the human eye is not calibrated, we can't judge distances very well. And because we can't judge distances, we don't want to talk about following distances as a component of so many car lengths or a football field or whatever it may be, because everybody's concept of those different distances is a little different. So we talk in terms of seconds.
Yeah, you know,
time.
let me interrupt you right there.
Sure.
You and I were talking before the show that when I went to take driver training, they taught us to stay so many car lengths per 10 miles an hour behind the vehicle in front of you. And that has changed, hasn't it?
It really has, yes, because there again, the eye's not calibrated. So what we want people to do is when the vehicle in front of you passes a fixed object, whether it be a sign or a light pole or something on the road, whatever it may be, then you start to count 1001, 1002, 1003. And for automobiles, it's roughly 3 seconds at highway speeds for following distance. Now for trucks, because of the extreme stopping distances due to their size and weight, you're talking in terms of 6 or 7 seconds behind the following vehicle that they should be to maintain a safe distance.
And you and I were also talking a little earlier before the show that people have the wrong concept of how much time actually passes. They'll say it takes, this went on for a minute or a minute and a half, and it's really a matter of 2 or 3 seconds.
That's absolutely right.
Why do people make that mistake?
Well, what we learn and what I learned in terms of investigating accidents is that while we may see things in video, so to speak, moving, when we recall things, we recall them more in photographs. So the time standard more or less changes with regard to what you might recall about what occurred in an accident.
So some of the main causes then are following too closely, inability to stop because of that, fatigue. Let's talk about driver fatigue. We were talking about the odd thing about the regulations. Tell our audience what's required under the Federal Motor Safety Act with respect to how much somebody can drive and when they have to rest.
Sure, and it's interesting to note that these regulations have been around since the Motor Carrier Act of 1935. They were initially part of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and in 1966, when the Department of Transportation was formed, the safety component of the regulations changed from the Interstate Commerce Commission to the U.S. Department of Transportation. There have always been hours of service regulations. They were modified a little bit in 2003 and 2005, but their drivers are allowed to drive now for 11 hours, and they can have an additional 3 hours of on-duty not driving time. And that's for things like fueling the vehicle, loading, unloading, things of that nature. Mm-hmm. That's for a total of 14 hours before they're required to take a 10-hour break.
Is there a time of the day that's more dangerous to drive on the highway when big trucks are out there than others?
There is. The largest and most comprehensive study that was done is the fatigue and alertness study by the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Canadian Department of Transportation, and the Trucking Research Institute. And that determined that time of day is the most consistent predictor of fatigue. It's typically between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m., really those hours that individuals would tend to be asleep anyway.
Well, in your own personal driving your vehicle, do you stay off the road between midnight and 6 a.m. as a general rule?
Well, I think as a general rule I do. Every now and then it's going to happen that you're going to be there, but I think you need to be aware that that is a primary time period for fatigue. The other thing, though, the study determined is that individual drivers are not the most accurate predictors of their own level of fatigue. So that's something else that needs to be taken into consideration.
They miss it, don't they?
They do,
Yeah.
yes, sir.
We are going to come back in a minute and talk more about things that you should watch out for. But before we break, if you're going down the highway and this big trucker's right behind you and you feel he's on your bumper, what should you do?
Well, you should really try to avoid that situation, get out of the way if you can, even if you need to take to the shoulder, because what you need to consider is that if there were to be a problem, you had to swerve for an animal in the road, or you had a tire blowout or something like that, there is absolutely no way that that truck could avoid hitting your vehicle.
Okay. No, you just got to use common sense.
And be aware.
Okay. We'll be back in a couple of minutes with our third and final segment with Whitney Morgan, and you'll probably learn some more interesting things about truckers. See you in a minute. Hey, we're back with Whitney Morgan of the Motor Carrier Safety Consultants in Birmingham. He's made a career out of investigating trucking accidents, what causes them. And you know, when you get hit by an 18-wheeler, Whitney, you're in trouble if it doesn't kill you or do some serious damage.
You sure are.
So it's one of those things you got to be really careful about. Let's talk for a minute, Whitney, about some of the cases you've worked on that you can share with our audience. Maybe some unusual things that occurred that resulted in serious injury to people on the highways.
Certainly, happy to do that. A lot of the cases that I deal with really deal primarily with driver error on both sides, both the operation of the automobile or SUV or in the commercial motor vehicle. And driver error really develops in a lot of different ways. We've talked about some of those, whether it be too fast for the conditions, following too closely, things of that nature, but also because of the articulation, which is the fact that a commercial motor vehicle that's made up of a tractor and a semi-trailer is connected by a fifth wheel. And due to that articulation between the two units, we've got what's called off-tracking. And that means that the rear of the trailer is going to off-track to the inside of the turn. And because of that, drivers need to be aware of that when they're making tight turns, where they're going into a facility to get fuel, or if they're just making a right-hand turn at an intersection.
Let me interrupt you just to explain what you mean by off-tracking.
Sure.
You're talking about the back tires of the truck don't follow the same path as the front tires.
That's exactly right.
They're off-tracked a little bit, and that causes the drivers to hit curbs and cars on the side of the road and pedestrians even, maybe.
That's right.
Things
and
like that.
That off-tracking can actually be as much as 16 feet or more into the inside of the turn. So what drivers are taught to do is to extend the turn to the area that they're turning into and make that turn and keep the rear of the trailer as close to the curb as possible. This prevents vehicles from getting alongside the vehicle, and then you have the pinch play or the squeeze play, as we call it. And what drivers want to do is what's called a jug handle turn, where they will swing wide to the left before going into or making their turn. What that does is a couple of things. One, it allows the rear of the trailer to get away from the curb. It sends a mixed message to a trailing vehicle that the truck may be changing lanes, and then people will try to pass that truck on the right-hand side. And because of the blind spots around the truck, with the area we call the no zone, once a vehicle's in that no zone area or blind spot area, the truck driver can't see that vehicle and continues to make their turn, and then a collision results as a result of that.
Let's just go to a high-speed accident. I know you've had many of those over your career.
Sure.
Can you give us an example of an accident that you've investigated involving high-speed error by the trucker?
Well, there again we talk about speed for conditions, and even under normal conditions, the driver has to be careful of their speed and manage their speed and the space around that vehicle. And what happens oftentimes, and what I see a lot, is deals with where the driver's vision is impeded by, say, a hill or a curve. And what truck drivers want to do oftentimes is maintain their speed so they don't have to downshift and slow the vehicle down. Typically, they're on a time schedule, and that's something the everyday motorist needs to take into consideration. But they don't slow down oftentimes for hills and curves that they cannot see over or see around. And what they don't know is what they may encounter once they top that hill or around that curve. Could be a slow moving vehicle, could be an accident, could be traffic backed up for whatever reason. And that creates a lot of accident situations for truckers.
So that's the proverbial accident waiting to happen when they do that.
It absolutely is.
Yeah. So if a trucker is on an interstate highway going over a hill and he's got a posted speed limit of 70 miles an hour, you know, how does he know, or how slow should he slow down to in order to avoid the unforeseen? How does that work?
Well, drivers need to understand their particular vehicle, and that's why drivers of commercial vehicles are expected to get that commercial driver's license and have that additional knowledge and training necessary to safely operate the vehicle. So it's important for them to understand the limitations of that vehicle and the things that the vehicle can and can't do, how long it takes the vehicle to do these types of things and make these maneuvers, and then they need to adjust for that. There's not really any set speed, although I can say that at night, drivers are taught not to overdrive their headlights. And this is true whether you're driving an automobile or a truck. You don't want to drive so fast that you can't stop for something or avoid something that's outside of the vision provided to you by the field of your headlights. So that's, everybody's, I think, heard that term, overdriving your headlights, and that's what we mean by that.
Well, can you give us an example of how long it takes to stop an 18-wheeler? I know that it varies depending on how much weight it's got and how long it is and what kind of braking it is. But generally, the distance it takes to stop an 18-wheeler at 60 miles an hour, say, versus a car at 60 miles an hour, what's the difference?
Well, generally we talk in terms from a training standpoint of needing roughly 6 to 7 seconds to stop an 18-wheeler. And another common misconception, and this is by a lot of drivers, including some experienced drivers of commercial vehicles, is that these trucks are designed, the braking systems are designed that the vehicle can stop when it's heavily loaded. And that's the way they're manufactured. When the vehicles are not loaded and are empty, actually because they're lighter and have less traction, the vehicles are actually longer, have longer stopping distances and are harder to stop because they're actually designed to stop better when they are loaded.
So if you're talking to the average driver on the highway, sort of sum up what advice you would give that driver if he comes across or has to deal with an 18-wheeler in close proximity to his car.
Sure, and I think it really comes down to having an awareness of your environment, having some basic understanding of the limitations that a truck driver has, knowing that trucks need more space and more room. You need to give them that additional space, additional room. Don't change lanes right in front of a commercial motor vehicle. Give that vehicle plenty of distance to maneuver and to stop if necessary.
And that could save your life, couldn't it?
It absolutely can, yes, sir.
Okay, well, that's. I want to thank you very much for appearing today, Whitney. We've enjoyed having you here, and I hope you've learned something from him about big wheel truckers, not ice road truckers. See you next week.